Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Um, how are you so far? So far, so good. So I'm a bit kind of hesitating. On one hand, I want you to see well. On the other hand, I want you to be awake. So I'm not sure. What do you prefer? Can you stay awake?
Since we have all the slides on the board.
So with lights? Yeah. Okay. It would be easier for me as well because then I get to see you. So that's a good thing. Oh, one extra thing here. Okay, so I'm very glad that Rafa could give a talk this morning because what we had planned for today is really kind of looking at connections between the methods which have been developed or used in genomics and the methods which we can use in our field. And that's kind of the theme for the whole day. So how do we deal with experiments which quantify many analytes, transcripts, proteins, in a single run, multiple runs, and so on. And so we will actually go over many of the things that Rafa mentioned. I was actually really happy to see that he was talking about this. So we'll take it slowly. If you know, I apologize, but I hope that it will help us to be all on the same page. And so this is the plan. So 3 things again. So one is I will review the very intro that we did last week because I think it's important to put things in context a little bit, what we're trying to achieve with different types of methods. Then I will talk about methods which I see used a lot in quantitative mass spectrometry without really kind of knowing the properties of the methods sometimes. So we'll talk about that. And we will start talking about unsupervised methods today. And tomorrow, if time allows, I will talk about supervised methods. And we have the slides on GitHub, right? Slides on GitHub. Okay, so let's take a look. So again, I apologize for those of you who were in this classroom last week because it's a review, but I think it's important. So when we do some statistical analysis work with this type of experiments, we can think of the goals of statistical methods broadly kind of partitioned into 3 groups. And these 3 types of statistical goals, they have to do something with the class or group or things which are similar, either in terms of samples in the space of analytes or analytes in the space of samples. And so the first statistical goal in this multidimensional experiments is class discovery. So this is what is called unsupervised method. And so this will be the type of methods which we just saw this morning. So here would be a heat map where the rows are the analytes, so proteins. The columns are samples, so for example, biological subjects. And the color intensity reflects the abundance of the particular analyte in the particular sample. And so kind of the convention usually is red means upregulated and dark color means more intense, and blue means downregulated, and darker color is stronger downregulation. And so the goal of class discovery would be something like that. Well, let's find, for example, biological samples which have similar profiles across the space of analytes. And this can be useful, for example, if you have tumor samples and you find a subset of the samples are more similar to each other than the other, then maybe this is a tumor subtype or some kind of important thing. So on one hand, and on the other hand, if we have, for example, particularly if the samples are actually time course or some kind of response to stress, like for example in this example where we have the x-axis as a time point and the y-axis is the abundance of the protein, so then we may want to find groups of analytes which have similar profiles across the samples. And this may also be important because if they behave similarly, maybe they're all implicated in the same response process, and that's also important. So this would be one. And the other that we started talking about is principal component analysis. So essentially each principal component, so here we have 2 of them, each axis is a linear combination of all the analytes. So if you have 1,000 proteins, the x-axis will be protein 1 times some number, plus protein 2 times some number, plus protein 3 times some number, and so on. And so these numbers, which multiply each protein, will be selected such that we can see most variation among our samples. So here, each point is a replicate in the space of these two linear combinations. And so the idea is that if we can have a lot of differences in location of these points, it means that our data have some information to essentially distinguish them. But that's pretty much it. So the limitation of these methods is, well, the good thing is that they're unsupervised, so you don't tell the method which sample comes from which group or which gene comes from which group. So it's a good thing, but it's also a limitation because essentially you tell your method, go and find something. And the method will find something, but is it useful to you? Well, who knows, right? It depends. And so, for example, some of these profiles that you see here, they very much reflect the batch effect that Raf talked about as opposed to some real biological effect. And these unsupervised methods will have no way to know that what is useful to you versus what is not, because you did not give the information on what is useful. And so I find that these methods are extremely overused. So the methods are really good for visualizing the data, and as Rafa said, this is something that you would do first in the beginning of your study as a screening. You can see how much information is there potentially. The PCA plot is really good for quality control. So, for example, if you have all these samples in one cloud and then one sample stays apart, it's not as likely that it's biology, it's more likely that technologically something failed. And it made it very difficult. So this will be really nice ways to screen for some issues. But, other than that, so for example, what people do sometimes for PCA, when I just said protein 1 times some number plus protein 2 times some number, the larger the number, the more important the proteins are, some people think. And this is very wrong because we cannot really look at the importance of these numbers as some kind of biological importance. And we will come back to this. So essentially, this is really limited to quickly screening, visualizing the data, but there's no concept such as, I don't know, p-values, error rates, anything like that. Okay, so this is statistical goal number 1. So statistical goal number 2 is what we have spent most time on so far. So now this is a supervised method, which says I'm labeling each subject in my study, or each biological replicate, as group 1 versus group 2. And I want to know what is changing in abundance between the groups on average over the replicates. And so it is supervised because now we label each sample with the group. And so now, because we're interested in difference between the groups, we tell the method what is the useful change for us and versus what's the nuisance change. Or the nuisance variation is the variation within each group. So this is something we have to work against, and this is something we're interested in. And so that's what we have done. So this is exactly what MStats is doing. And so we compare the average protein abundance in one group versus the other group. MStats reports p-values. Alternative methods, you can have Bayesian methods, will report posterior probabilities. It's just different ways to go about the same problem. And by the way, MStats can also use, so you have seen already, so it reports the summaries where we can have one number per protein per sample, and this can be used as input to this type of plots. So this is also quite useful. But so just to clarify, as I mentioned this last week, so a common mistake that I see in mass spectrometry in particular is that people will say, okay, I have a protein which changes between conditions, it has small p-value, I did all the right things, well, therefore I found a biomarker. And so as we discussed last week, protein with a small p-value is not necessarily a biomarker. And the reason is because biomarker is supposed to be actionable on an individual subject and not on the average subject in the population. Because the doctor in the clinic doesn't have the average subject in front of them, they have a specific person. And they need to make a decision for this particular person. Is this person healthy, or does the person have a disease, or is the person likely to respond to a therapy or not? And so this was the point we looked at. So here is a situation where we have a systematic change between conditions, and the variance around, the nuisance variance around the mean is relatively small. So this change is unlikely to be an artifact of random variation. So if a person comes in with this protein abundance, it's very likely that this person is in this group, and it's less likely in this group. So this will be a situation where a protein is differentially abundant and also predictive, so it's also actionable. But here's another situation now where we have a lot of variation around the mean within each group, so a lot of nuisance variation. And so if a person comes in with this protein abundance, it can be this group or it can be this group. So we cannot predict if the person is healthy or has a disease. However, if we have enough replicates, we are really, really confident in this mean, really confident in this mean, and we can say that this change is not likely to be an artifact of random chance. So we can still claim upregulation, but it will not be a biomarker, it will not be actionable for individual person. So this is differentially abundant but most predictive. And this was the opposite as well. If we have two proteins, so here is a situation where protein 1 has low values for healthy, high values for disease. Protein 2, the same thing, low values for healthy, high values for disease. So we will have small p-values, and we can predict, based on protein abundance, who comes from which group. Here, on the other hand, the blue dots span the full range of protein 1 and also the full range of protein 2. The red dots also span the full range of protein 1 and of protein 2. So hypothesis testing on individual protein, comparing the averages, will not give us any interesting result. However, as a panel of these two proteins, they're perfectly predictive. So this is the distinction, right? So there is a reason why we distinguish these statistical goals, is because we have different methods, and different methods will be appropriate for different goals. And just to finish this, so statistical goal 3 is class prediction, and this is what we want to do when we want to work with biomarkers. So now our goal is to classify subjects in each group. And so, for example, here if we have two proteins, so we have a decision rule where we ignore protein 1, and high level of protein 2 means healthy, low value of protein 2 means disease. And it will work reasonably well, except that some of the red dots are misclassified. So now we can have a more flexible rule where we use both proteins, and so now we have fewer red dots misclassified. And now we have some very flexible rule which leaves nothing misclassified, but it's likely that this particular rule is accommodating our data points too much, and it's probably not going to be exactly what is happening in the underlying population. And so the goal of the methods, and here you would use machine learning techniques for prediction, so to find a decision rule which is complex enough to reflect the reality, but not too complex to avoid overfitting. And so the type of methods that you would use would be, I don't know, logistic regression, support vector machine, random forests, what else? Like this linear discriminant analysis, there's a variety of methods to classification trees, right? So you can choose many methods. And so the type of output that you will look here would be not p-value, but it will be misclassification rate. And you would usually use a separate validation set of subjects which have never been used to develop these decision rules, to see how well this decision rule works on the next subjects. And so the choice of methods depends a little bit of what you expect from this type of predictive models, what you expect from them, right? So, for example, will you always expect that in the future you will always quantify 1,000 proteins? Or are you going to develop a new assay which only has a small number of proteins, which you highlighted as biomarkers? So this particular thing, so it's called supervised classification. We'll talk about this tomorrow, I hope. So what I would like to do today is to focus on class comparison, but now go over some of the methods which people use in genomics and see how they apply to us, and then start a little bit talking about the unsupervised methods. Okay. Are there questions? So just to kind of refresh, but I wanted to make sure that everybody who is new to this week have seen that, okay? So now our goal is to actually look at class comparisons. And so we have heard just now talking about lemma, and this is a very commonly used method. Well, obviously in gene expression microarrays, but it is also very commonly used for quantitative mass spectrometry experiments, and actually see many papers using that. And so I would like to kind of highlight the good and the bad things about lemma. And so to give you the upshot right away is that it only accounts for some aspect of variation that we have in mass spectrometry it doesn't account for other aspects, and therefore it is not the most effective approach. So, long story short, I would not advocate using this for quantitative mass spectrometry. But let's kind of go over this and see what are the good things for that and how we can kind of learn from the good things. So just to remind you also, this was our discussion from last week. What we're trying to do is to compare the abundances of the proteins in populations. So we assume that, and let me just talk about health and disease because it's easy, right? So we have a large population of subjects who have some properties which relate to protein abundance, such as age, gender, prior diseases, lifestyle, whatever you want, right? And so there are two populations like that which are similar to each other, actually identical to each other with respect to all of these properties, except for the fact that one population is healthy and the other population has the disease. And so we are in statistical goal number 2, so comparing the averages, right, as opposed to predicting the abundance of individual subjects. And just to remind you, in statistical practice, we use Greek letters to denote constants which we think exist, but we will never know the actual numbers behind them. So mu1 is the mean abundance of the protein among the healthy subjects, and mu2 is the mean abundance of the protein in the subjects with the disease. So our kind of abstractive thinking is that these constants actually exist out there in the nature, but we will never ever know their value. But they exist, right? And we can make some statements about them. So we cannot really interrogate every subject, so we include a subset of subjects in our study from the populations. And so now this was our first layer of variation, and then we quantify the abundance of protein from the subjects using the technology which is itself noisy. And so this is what we actually observe. So we use Latin letters to indicate the observable quantities. So this is some summary of protein abundance in group 1. This is some summary of protein abundance in group 2. And so the process of statistical inference is to take what we see and use it to make conclusions about what we want to know. And just to remind you, right, so the dangers were that the bias was that this was systematically different from this, and inefficiency is that this just has too much nuisance variation so that we cannot actually make useful statements about that. So this is really how the thinking goes, right? And so what MS-Stats is doing, we kind of looked at all the features, right, including things like outliers and missing values. We found the summary in group 1, summary of group 2. We looked at the variation associated with that, and we made some conclusions about the differences between the groups, right? So please stop me. So it's kind of, I know some of you have heard this, others have not heard, so I'm happy to slow down for those who hear it for the first time. So let me just take a pause. It's okay? Oh, excellent. Love it. Thank you. Okay, so that's what we do, right? And so different methods such as t-test or MS-Stats or limma, they have the same purpose. They do exactly that. There is no difference between them. What is different is how they go about summarizing these signals that we have from mass spectra and how we go about deriving the variability associated with them. And so that's really the main distinction. And so there are advantages or disadvantages of different methods, primarily based on this. What's a good summary and what's a good estimate of variation? So let us review a little bit what we did with t-test, right? So as I just said, we never know what the true differences between the populations are, but hey, we can make assumptions, right? We can make guesses, and so we will make a guess that in the population, so these are Greek letters, there is no difference between the groups. And so now we will see if our data actually support this evidence. And so what we did for this was, so if this is our null hypothesis, so the alternative is that it's not true, right? And we build this signal to noise ratio where the signal is the difference between the groups. And again, remember, it's on a log scale, right? And then the noise is the estimate of variation. So this was the square of the standard error of the first mean, right? This is the square of the standard error of the second mean, right? And so what we did, we overlaid this quantity on the reference bell-shaped curve, and if it was too much in the tail, we said that we have evidence against the null hypothesis, right? So that was our workflow. So far so good. So one interesting thing here is that we really did not require that the variances in different groups are identical, because we have the sample variance from the first group estimated separately. The sample variance from the second group is estimated separately. So that's really kind of the very simple t-test. Now, one generalization which can be done from that is to assume that different groups have different means, but they have the same variability around the mean. So here, if we have two groups, we assume that the variance around the mean is the same. And it is particularly interesting when we have more than two groups. So here we have 5 groups. Each group has its own mean, but we will assume that the variance around the mean is the same. So now, instead of estimating 5 different variances, we actually estimate only one variance. And this can be useful because if we want a different variance in each group, let's say we have 5 replicates here, 5 replicates here, and so on, well, the variances estimated from a single group are not very reliable. Now, if we can assume that all the variances are the same, then the deviations of each data point from its mean, they are all informative of the same variance. Well, there's a shift in the mean, but we don't care because we look at the deviation from the respective means. And they are all informing us of the same parameter, of a single variance which is common across all the groups. So if the assumption of constant variance is useful, then in fact using more groups is the same as increasing your sample size, because you have more data to evaluate the variation around the mean. And so some designs actually rely on that. So if you have good reasons to believe that the variance is constant, getting more time points or more groups, even if you have less replicates in each group, will effectively allow you to increase your number of data points to characterize the variation around the mean. Now, of course, the question is, how do I know that the variance is the same? Well, you can make some exploratory plots and so on, but it's true that you would need enough replicates to know that the variance is the same. So it's kind of a little bit of a circular argument, right? You are most helped with this assumption if you have a small sample size, but you would need a larger sample size to convince yourself that this assumption is actually true. So what people usually do is, well, they just look at the past experiments like we did in the sample size calculation before. If your past data indicate that different groups have roughly the same variance or maybe roughly the same relationship to the mean intensity, then you can combine this information across groups. And the reason it's useful, maybe I just remind you what we talked about before. So here the x-axis is the sample size. This was some kind of strange population with the strange values that it has. And so if we take the mean of this many replicates and we repeat it multiple times and we plot it, we see that the mean kind of varies and eventually it stabilizes around the true value when the sample size is large. But if we look at sample standard deviation, the picture is different, right? So if we have a small sample size, not only standard deviation varies, but it also is more systematically below the true value. So we may actually underestimate the true variance more likely than overestimate. And so we can be too optimistic. So essentially, estimating variance correctly is very important. And especially if we have a small sample size, so assuming that the variance is the same across all the groups will allow us to improve the estimation of variation by combining the deviations from the respective means across all the groups. Does it make sense? Right? So this is called the pooled estimate of variance in t-test or in analysis of variance and so on. So this is very useful. So how it is done exactly? Well, very simple. So we now assume that this variance is the same for all the groups. And so now this variance is a weighted mean from the first group and the second group. So if for group 1 has more replicates, it will have higher weight than if group 2 has fewer replicates. So this is what happens with 2 groups, and we can kind of generalize this to multiple groups as well. So the result is that we actually end up with a single variance parameter and some constant as our estimate of noise, as opposed to 2 variance parameters. Okay, so this is nothing new. This has been done like forever, right, in statistics, and you don't need to have genomic data to do this. So But the important thing is that now we only have one parameter, right? So now we simplified our life because we have one nuisance parameter as opposed to separate nuisance parameters per group. Okay, so now the problem is, so as I mentioned, right, especially when we have small sample size, this noise parameter can be unstable and systematically too small, sometimes larger but systematically small. And of course, it affects quite a bit the location of the signal-to-noise ratio, right, on top of our reference curve. So getting this denominator right is important. And really getting the denominator right means getting this constant right, because this is just part of our design. So we really need to have this sample variance correctly. And so how can we do better than just doing simple things like that? And so this was really a very important contribution by Gordon Smythe in Australia. And it was important not only because it really kind of proposed a new way to analyze this data, but it really set up the whole kind of direction of statistical thinking on how we can reuse the fact that we use many, many, many genes or many, many proteins as part of the same experiment. So that's what's going on. So the traditional approach does that, right? So we have our signal to noise, and this is the constant. So here I had it squared, so now here I just took it out of the square root. Some constant, right? And if the null hypothesis is true, it follows the student distribution. So what I didn't mention is this degree of freedom, but we talked about this a little bit last week, right? So this is how many data points are free to vary after we have estimated the means of each group. And so it's a fixed number, which is a function of the sample size, essentially. So it's a function of n1 and n2. So, and this function and this degree of freedom defines how heavy the tails of this bell-shaped curve are. So the larger the sample size, the larger the degree of freedom, the closer the bell-shaped curve is to normal distribution. If the sample size is small, this quantity is small, and the tails are heavier. So we have more probability of type 1 error. So just technical thing. So, but this is what they really propose, and this is, I think, is very nice. So they said, okay, we have this quantity, and it's unstable. It's hard to estimate. But we do it over and over and over for every gene. So if we have 1,000 genes, we have 1,000 numbers like that. So clearly, one gene from another, they vary in their nuisance variation, right? Not every gene is regulated the same way. However, they come all from the same biological organism, from the same, sample type, from the same data processing workflow. So they must share something between them. So how can we look at that? So what they propose is to essentially take all of our genes or proteins in our context and plot 1 over this quantity squared, just the histogram of this over each gene. So just like literally, I kind of have this curve type of shape, but really you just make a histogram. So why 1 over s squared? Just because mathematically it works better. But it kind of looks a curve like that, right? And actually you can see it easily because remember we tend to underestimate the variance. So 1 over this will give us kind of large tail here, right? Very rarely this value will be large, so 1 over it will be very rarely small. So it will tend to have this type of shape. And this type of shape actually has a well-known distribution called chi-square. So it's not just arbitrary, there is a whole theory behind that. And so what you can do, take the histogram and you actually fit this chi-square curve to the histogram. So how do we fit the curve? Well, we actually vary two things. So chi-square has a parameter, which is a degree of freedom, which affects its shape on one hand, and then we scale it by some other constant. So what we're doing is we vary this d0 and s0 to the point that this curve fits our histogram in the best possible way. And so now, it turns out, so we can actually interpret this constant. So this d0 is the average of consensus degree of freedom or representative degree of freedom for the whole experiment. And S0 is the consensus or average nuisance variance across all the genes and all the samples. And so now, and this is again not just they claiming that, but there is essentially a Bayesian statistical framework which allows us to derive the fact that our signal-to-noise ratio with this type of approach actually amounts to a very similar expression, except that our estimate of variation now is a weighted combination of whatever we had for our individual gene and this consensus average variance over all the genes. And the weights are determined by relative degrees of freedom. Remember, degree of freedom relates to the replicates. So on one hand, we have the replicates in our study. On the other hand, we have the consensus replicates, so how much information content we think on average we have among the genes. And so if the number of replicates is high, this will have high weight, this will have almost no effect. If the number of replicates is small, then we will probably be biasing our estimate of variance towards some kind of constant variance over all the genes. So essentially, so our data set looks like that. So essentially it's an array, right? So we have, let me just keep the genomic notation. Gene 1, gene 2, gene whatever, M. And here is subject 1, subject 2, subject 3, subject 4. And let's say that these subjects are all healthy, these are all disease. And so what we're doing with the regular t-test, we compare these replicates to these replicates separately, these replicates to these replicates separately, right? And so we have a p-value for this, p-value for this, and p-value for this. But to get the p-value, we need to have a sample variance for this, and then we have sample variance for this, and we assume that this variance equals the same this variance. We separately assume that this equals this, and so on, right? And so what we could do, so actually this particular figure, if you only have two replicates, your estimate of person-to-person variation will not be very good, right? Because you only have two replicates. So if we assume that this variance equals to this, okay, now we have a little bit more information because we only have one quantity to estimate. We could potentially assume that all the variances are the same. Then we just have one number from the entire experiment, but this would be really not good because it would assume that every gene is regulated the same way, which is not true. And so what Limma is doing essentially finds a compromise where it's a weighted average between what we have separately for each gene. So this is S for gene 1, this is separate S for gene 2, and so on, and some overall consensus variance, which we get as a single number across the entire experiment. And so it's neither one nor the other. It's a weighted combination, so it's kind of the middle ground. And how much more weight you give to the individual values versus the overall single constant, well, will depend on the curve fit to this 1 over variance. So that's it. So we are essentially, the purpose of Limma is to improve the estimate of variation. And of course, you probably know that if we have 100 replicates here and 100 replicates here, we will have no challenges, right? We can estimate variance separately for each group, no problem. So it really helps when the sample size is small. And it was developed originally when microarrays were expensive. Everybody had few replicates. Sounds familiar, right? So we're kind of in a similar type of situation. Okay, and so just to kind of finish this, this was actually from the book that Rafa co-authored in 2005. We're kind of in the very early days of statistical methods for microarrays. And so they had an experiment where you have seen this already from MS Stats, right? Volcano plots are very common ways to represent the results. So the x-axis is the log fold change. The y-axis, well, they use something else here, but we use negative log p-value, right? So essentially, we're interested in this corner and this corner. So this plot shows the t-test, so what we discussed previously. This plot shows the output of the modified approach, where now our estimate of variance is this weighted average between the groups. And so you see that this plot is much cleaner, right? Because here we can have really large log fold changes which are not significant. Color indicates significant comparisons, and black dots means not significant. So we can have very large fold changes which are not significant, or we can have very small fold changes which are significant. But it's probably easy to guess that some of this was just the artifact of how well we estimate the noise separately for each gene. And so here we kind of clean it up quite a bit. It's much more following this kind of 45-degree lines or so, right? Because now more consistently what we estimate as large fold change is significant. What we estimate as small fold change is not significant. So it does eliminate some of the uncertainty associated with the estimation of this constant. So this is a good thing. I think this is really helpful when you have many genes to draw from, right, to learn from, a relatively small number of replicates here, so that you really cannot reliably estimate all of these things, right? And it works. So the problem now is that when we try to take it to the quantitative mass spectrometry and the experiments that we talk about here, we actually have other problems, right? So what this thing assumes, it assumes a t-test, meaning that we have one number per gene or protein per sample, right? It's not our data, right? Our data has many features, many ions, right, for the same protein. It has missing values, it has outliers, and all of that. So by the time you get to this data structure, you may already have introduced some inefficiencies or summarized things incorrectly, right? Because the outliers had too much influence, missing values not handled correctly, or some biases in terms of number of features in each sample, and so on. So you may be doing well handling this variance situation, but if the summarization is not appropriate, things will be really compromised. And so if your individual estimates are not correct, borrowing information across the proteins from incorrect quantification will be only, will have only limited effect. And limit does not address this at all. So it really starts with one number per protein per sample. And so I see people often get very excited because saying, okay, this is developed for high dimensional data. Yes, but it will not address the summarization, and it will not be helpful when you have a relatively large sample size. So the utility of this is actually very limited. Now, the good thing about limma is also the way how it is implemented, because it can express complex designs. And so if you remember, we worked with MS stats where we had this contrast function, right? We say we want to compare group 1 with group 2 or group 2 with group 3. This was actually inspired from limma. And so this is exactly the same type of settings as limma has in R. So that is nice. So limma can handle multiple groups and complex comparisons. But it doesn't handle summarizations, and it doesn't handle missing values and things like that. So to kind of compare this for our data set, and I think you will be doing this later in a hands-on session. So let me just show you a little bit what it looks like. So, well, first of all, the top row is the summarization of log sum, and this is what I see is being most frequently done if people use limma. So they take all the features in the run of the same protein, take the sum, then take the log, right? And so this will be one number in this table. Right? Here again, take all the features of the protein, take the sum, and take the log. So from this point, so now this is the summarization. So from this point, we can do several things. We can do t-test, we can do limma, and we can still use the methods in MS stats, which is essentially just ANOVA if you have more than 2 groups, which we do, right, for the IPRG data set. So here we compare condition 1 versus condition 2, and 3 replicates per group. So the these are volcano plots. So the x-axis is log fold change, and the y-axis is minus log adjusted p-value. So what we see is that the t-test is not very sensitive here because the sample size 3 replicates is fairly little. And then limma and MS stats are somewhat similar in how they behave, right? And so this is comparing condition 1 to condition 2, and we have 6 spiked proteins, right? And so limma finds 10, 11, 12 spiked proteins, right? MS stats finds, or ANOVA finds 10, and then t-test finds 4, 5, 6. So clearly, some things which go into the summarization here don't allow us to do a good job at this stage, right? On the other hand, what we can also do, we can use the summary of MS stats and then apply either just t-test or limma or condition 1 versus condition 2 with ANOVA, right? And so now you see that after our summary, t-test doesn't find a whole lot, and lemma and MS stats agree in how things behave, right? And they find exactly 6 changes here. So this is helpful, right? So essentially the message is right summarization helps, and then doing the right analysis after the summarization helps. But remember, we only have 3 replicates here, right? So the next example is from a different study, which is also label-free shotgun experiment, but now it has 50, it meant to be 0, 50 replicates per group. And so same idea. So here is the log sum summarization, here is the MS stat summarization, and here is different methods. And essentially you see that we have fewer differences with MS stat summarization than with log sum. But other than that, lemma didn't help much, right? So it didn't have a big difference compared to that. So when the number of replicates is larger, there is really no reason to do that. When the number of replicates is small, the choice would depend on whether the concern is more in missing values and outliers and summarization, or the concern is in variance estimation. And so potentially it's possible actually to combine both approaches where you do MS stat summarization and then you do lemma if you think that variance estimation is an issue. But generally my personal advice in terms of good practice is just to have more replicates, because we talked about this enough, right? That it will cover all the other issues that you may have in addition to just that. How's it going? Okay? Yeah. Oh.
Maybe a stupid question,
Yeah.
but because we work with log transform data, right? So when you calculate standard deviation, does the formula remains the same, or does it?
Oh, yeah. So everything we do is done on the log scale.
So the formula for the standard deviation
Is the regular formula. So here let's see, here the y is on the log scale. Everything is on the log scale. So whatever you do is applied to the log intensity. So as we talked earlier, is that it implies some things on the original scale, right? So our summary is actually geometric means, right, on the original scale. But everything we do here is just like log scale up front. Yeah.
Like just maybe you can go back to the slide where you compare to Caleb plots. It's over here. So you argue that the plot to the right is easier.
It's not easier to read, but it's our ability to detect difference is more consistent with the data than here, right? Because here essentially there's less agreement between fold change and variability and conclusions of differential abundance. Here it's much more clear that larger fold changes, they tend to be easier to detect as significant because our estimation of variance is much more similar to each other, and so they're much more close to constants. Oh, yeah, of course. So that is not going away, right? So you have the signal to noise here. You have this new value for the degrees of freedom. So now again, you have your bell-shaped curve. You overlay this new quantity on top of the bell-shaped curve, and you see if it's within the decision, the acceptance, or if it's within the rejection region or outside of the rejection region. Well, so what you do choose is your alpha value, right? So the type 1 error, right? So remember how it works, right? So I need to keep that. So this is our student distribution. So this is 0. So this is student with d degrees of freedom. So as d increases, it becomes kind of closer and closer to normal, right? So lower and lower tails, but let's kind of ignore that. And so what you do choose before, and you choose it actually before designing the experiment, like at the very beginning, is the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when in fact the null hypothesis is true. So you take alpha, you assign half here, and so now we have this new formula to calculate the signal to noise, and we overlay this on top of this curve. So if it comes here, we say, yeah, well, that's what we expected, if the null hypothesis is true. So no evidence against the null hypothesis. If it falls way in the tail, we say, wait a minute, it's very unusual for this distribution, how unusual? Well, we have allocated only 5% probability to be in these regions. So at the confidence level of 5%, we reject most.
Yeah, so you allocate these 5%, right? And then you look into the points on your volcano plot, but on the volcano plot to the right there is a clear cluster, which is somewhat very clear to discriminate. That's probably where my truth is lie on the left-hand side. There is a clear cloud which is separated from all the rest.
Well, so this comes from the book, so I'm not sure what happened with these fold changes, because you're right that from 0.5 to 10, this numerator is not changed. So the numerator is staying the same, right? So since we plot here log fold change, so I would actually, and I see that the label of the axis is cut off, so I'll have to double check what happened. So, but the only thing that is supposed to change is the denominator, so the p-value associated with that. So the point here is that you can have a large visible change or small visible change, and it may not be kind of the same. It may not be as easy to say that it is systematic or not, because your estimation of variation is not very stable. So let me maybe give you another. I don't have the plots here, but Rafa was showing those MA plots, right? So Spanking experiments have been very common from microarray days, right? And so the way they advocated for these methods is also using Spanking experiments, showing that the spiked proteins stand out much better in this type of approach than if you just do regular t-test. So, and we can actually see this here as well, right? So for the t-test, you have a lot of things. So you see those gray dots, they have pretty large log fold changes, right? And so only a few of them are associated with differential abundance. So here, things kind of become more clear already. Okay? Question? Huh? All right, so, but again, so this is what it's doing. So my most important point here is that sometimes people give it a lot more importance than it really is, because all it's doing is estimating the variance better, as opposed to solving all the problems which have to do with large dimensional data. So that's really the most important point here. So lemma solves only a subset of issues. Okay, so this is one. So now let's talk about the other really important kind of aspect of this, which kind of changes our discussion quite a bit from what we've done now. But maybe before that, let me just take another minute to see if we're all clear on the previous side. Okay, so the next aspect, which is kind of a little bit more recent than lemma, but is also quite important for us, is work with count data. And by work with count data, I'm thinking specifically spectral counting. So in genomics, it came about when we started working with RNA-seq. And RNA-seq was very exciting because we could quantify things with higher sensitivity, right, and potentially higher resolution. So it was very nice. In mass spectrometry, it's actually kind of the opposite in that spectral counting is semi-quantitative, right? So it's not as good quality quantification as peak intensities, but it's easy to do, right? And so it is still used often as screening and things like that. So it is important to know how to analyze this data. So going back to our figure, so we have exactly the same question, right? We want to compare the same populations using some subjects, but now our data come as discrete values and not as continuous values. And because of that, it may change how we summarize the data, and it may change how we quantify the variability. So the discrete nature of the data really affects our view on what a good summary is and what a good variation. So you will actually maybe say, wait a minute, we talked about this before, so the central limit theorem, right? Why should we care? So maybe we can always talk about normal distributions, and you're right. So in some ways, when the counts are large, we can actually ignore the fact that they are counts, and we can still work with everything that we discussed before. Just to remind you this figure, so it also comes from this vignette of points of significance. So Naomi will be here this afternoon. She can tell us more about this. But the idea here was we want to understand how much variation we have in the mean of the data, right? And so here we start with the population which has continuous values and normally distributed. So what we do, we take 3 data points from this population, calculate the mean, 3 other data points, calculate the mean, 3 other, calculate the mean, then we do the histogram of the means, right? And so we see that as the sample size increases, the histogram becomes more and more narrow and more bell-shaped, right? And if we now start with something which is not normal, it will actually have the same type of pattern, except that it will take more replicates for this histogram to be narrow and more replicates for it to look more like the normal distribution. So it is important, right? So if we have a large sample size or large counts where we're kind of in this type of irregular situations, we can indeed claim central limit theorem and just use the t-test or lemma or whatever you want. So there's no problem. The problem is that oftentimes we are too close to 0, we're too irregular, and we have too few replicates to claim central limit theorem. And so, as Rafa was saying earlier, if you work, for example, with single cell RNA-seq experiments, so the majority of your measurements are 0, right? Well, that's clearly not normal, right? And your number of replicates will be also like 3 or 5, so that's clearly not central limit theorem setting. So we need to do something else. So we need to, for these particular cases, we need to work with spectral counts that have skewed discrete distributions, have many zeros, and the summaries do not yet have the central limit theorem, right? And so just to remind you kind of the type of labeling things that we talk about, so essentially have proteins digested in each sample, so label free. So the peak is selected for fragmentation. The frequency with which the peak is selected for fragmentation is related to the abundance of the underlying analyte. And so if we get to see more MSMS spectra from the peak, it can be used as a proxy of protein abundance, right? So more abundant proteins will have more MSMS spectra than low abundant proteins. And so we can compare the counts of MSMS spectra to see if there is a change in abundance, right? And it has been actually very popular in earlier years because it requires less software, right? So all you need to do is identify MSMS spectra. You don't need to look for peaks, quantify and all of that. But I think now this is less of a limitation, but it's still useful as a screener. Okay, so that's what we try to do. So we were just saying that our distributions are non-normal, they're discrete, they're skewed. So what we need to do is actually find statistical ways to describe the distributions as they are, right? As opposed to claim the central limit theorem. And so there are 2 types of probability distributions which are particularly useful for that. And so let me give you a warning, that's kind of where things methodologically become a little bit advanced. So I will be hand waving a little bit more here, okay? Because I don't want to scare you. But here's what's going on, right? So Poisson distribution looks like that. So the Poisson distribution is motivated by the process where you say, let me wait for a particular amount of time, let me watch for events happening with a particular probability, and let me count how many events occurred during this fixed time, right? And so in the context of RNA-seq, you can say, okay, let's just kind of have my experiment running for that long. Let me get the transcripts kind of counted, right, and see how many transcripts actually count. In mass spectrometry, we say, okay, we have a run, right? So a peak is appearing in this particular retention time window. Let's see how often it's sequenced, right? So that is the count of the events. And so it can only take discrete values 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And so the Poisson distribution is characterized with one parameter, which is essentially its population mean. And so here we see that the population mean is very small. It's 1/2. So the majority of counts will be 0 and a little bit of 1s. Here, if the mean is 1, so it's kind of shifting to the right, 3, 6, 9, and 12. So with 12, it behaves already roughly like a normal distribution. So if all of the proteins have more than 12 MSMS spectra, we can go ahead with on average, we can go ahead with the t-test. The problem is that we have many proteins, and some proteins will have many counts, others will have fewer counts. So we have to use these methods to essentially work with the worst case scenario. And so that's what's going on. So this is the Poisson distribution. So this lambda is a parameter which is its population mean. And our goal would be to compare. So we have these counts now here in condition 1. So we combine all the samples. We say, okay, how many times this protein was selected for fragmentation? We have this other group of subjects, how many times it's compared. It was selected, and we try to characterize the mean of the counts in this group versus the mean of the counts in this group, and see if this mean changing more systematically than as expected by random chance.
So my colleagues have mentioned that they've been doing that kind of long time, that this works label free but not labeled. Is that true?
What do you mean this? What is this? This works.
Well, the Poisson distribution would be more suited for label free but not labeled.
Well, it's a very broad statement, so it depends a little bit. So, you know, the Poisson distribution is just the tip of the iceberg. So, just like we talked before, we have means between the groups, right? And we talked about blocking, we talked about batch effects, right? So if you do it right, it will work. So same thing here. I'm being very simplistic here, saying, okay, we combine all the counts here versus here. If you start having labeling and whatnot, well, you will need to do a little bit more work on the analysis side, right?
So labeling data still is, it's still spectral counts.
You can have spectral counts with labeled data.
Okay.
But you need to analyze it differently, right? So essentially, you need to account for labeling in your analysis strategy. So you cannot just take it as is and run the same thing. That's for sure. Okay, but so the idea is really that. So let's say this was group 1, this was group 2. We want to know what is the change in the means of these counts, but we will use the shape of Poisson distribution to discover what's more systematic than as expected by random chance. Okay, so that's what we do. Now, here's the problem with Poisson distribution. So it only has one parameter. So normal distribution has two parameters, mean and variance, right? And so now we can say, okay, there's a shift in the mean, but then there's different variability, right? We have two parameters to describe that. In Poisson distribution, the mean equals the variance. So if you have some way to characterize the mean, immediately it imposes a constraint on the variance. And oftentimes, it's very restrictive for us because even though variance depends on the mean, it may not necessarily be identical, right? And we want to have more flexibility. And there are some reasons why the variance often is larger than the mean. And this, by the way, is called overdispersion in statistical language. But kind of to put it simple, we often have variance which comes from many sources, and it will exceed whatever is claimed by the Poisson distribution. And so to remedy this, a more frequently used approach is actually not based on the Poisson distribution, but based on a negative binomial distribution. So negative binomial is a generalization of a Poisson, which says that for a single person, the counts follow Poisson, but each person has its own person-to-person variation. And so all of these things combined give us this two-parameter negative binomial. And so just to put it in the context, well, I just took some figures from online. You know, there's plenty. We can generate these distributions in R as well. So if we vary a single parameter in Poisson, this is how the shape changes. But in negative binomial, we can have vary two parameters. It allows us to change not only the location, but also the extent of variation. So long story short, negative binomial generalizes the Poisson because it allows us to better characterize the variance in addition to the mean. And this is pretty much standard state of the art. So if you really want to work with count data, you will be much better off working with a negative binomial distribution. So if you have some methods which implement something, the very first thing to check is, okay, is it Poisson or negative binomial? If it's negative binomial, it will be better because Poisson is a special case of negative binomial. So it gives you more options, essentially, how to represent the data. Okay, so now I have this very kind of hairy slide. So as I promised, I will just hand wave, right? But I'll just tell you what the key components here are, and that's really all we need. So we have now, for a particular here gene, right, from replicate I and group J, whatever it is, right? So we can write this negative binomial distribution. You can write it in many ways. But what these researchers chose to do, they chose to write it exactly the same way as the normal distribution. So you can change the definition of parameters so that you have two parameters. One reflects the location, the other reflects the variability around the center. And so we have now these two parameters. One is the center of the distribution, and one is the variance. And you notice that the center and the variance, so G indicates the gene, so they're different for every gene, right? And they're different for each group, so this is interesting. So essentially, what we do now is we say that for each gene, we have some kind of skewed, distributions, which are characterized by both the mean and this dispersion. So essentially, which characterize the variation, right? So before we had normal distributions everywhere. Now we have this kind of different types of distributions, which reflect the discrete count and skewed nature of the data. And so in particular, when you have many zeros or things, just 0, 1, and 2, that's where it helps best. Okay, so this is the starting point. Can anybody think of a problem with that? It may be tricky, but still. Think quality control. Think normalization. We haven't talked about this at all, right? For count data. Yeah. So what we did say earlier that we do a lot of box plots, right, for quality control. So if this is a run, this is low intensity, right? So we will look at some shifts, right? And if there are some deviations, we will use some either medians, right, or some standards to essentially eliminate some of the systematic artifacts. So how do we eliminate them? Well, we will subtract some constants, right, on the log scale. These, by the way, are counts. They're not, there's no log, right? So these are actual counts of spectrum. So if we start doing things like multiplying or dividing these counts for the purpose of normalization, or do some other manipulations with them, we immediately lose the fact that these are discrete values, 0, 1, 2, and 3, right? So if we start dividing them or multiplying by some constant, we cannot work with Poisson and negative binomial anymore because it's not the same type of numbers. So it turns out that normalization here is more tricky in the sense that you cannot do normalization first and then use this Poisson and negative binomial distributions. So you have to do something else. And so the solution was to build in the normalization inside this negative binomial. And so instead of saying that you have the center of the distribution, which is separate for each gene and each condition, you multiply it by an extra factor, which is common for everything in that condition. So it's only subject, so actually I and J condition and run, because you want to account for differences between runs as well. So M is, in the language of RNA-seq, is a library size. In our language, it's just the number of MSMS spectra across all proteins in that run. And so, for example, if you have sample evaporation issues or some other issues, so the total number of acquired MSMS spectra can vary between runs. And so you want to make sure that they don't compromise our ability to detect differences. So it's essentially similar to normalization by total ion current, except that we don't have ion current, we have total number of MSMS spectra. And so what they do now is that they say, okay, we have the center of this distribution for each gene and each condition, but we also multiply it at the level of the parameter by a number which reflects how many spectra we acquired altogether in one sample versus the other sample. And so here, because we don't take the log, remember if we work on the original scale, they're all geometric means. So essentially they have this approach based on geometric median to calculate this library size. And then they just have this new expression for the negative, so before doing anything else, right? And then they have this new expression for negative binomial. And the very last piece, now they actually do exactly the same thing as Limma did. So when you want to work with dispersion, it will be the same problem. If you estimate this dispersion separately for each group and each condition, if you have a small number of replicates, again, it will be very noisy and it will be unstable. So they do exactly kind of things along the same lines. So they will plot the estimates of the mean, they will plot the estimates of dispersion over all the genes, find some kind of curve that they will fit to improve the estimates of these parameters. Now, this is much less kind of formalized statistically than in lemma because the math is much more difficult here. So it's much more empirical curve fitting to improve the estimate of variability. But it works quite well. So, and it's been done also by the same group who has worked with lemma. So this is the high level. So let me just kind of show you the results with DSIC. And I think that for count data with small number of replicates, it works quite well. So this is what happens, again, comparing condition 1 versus 2 on the IPRG data set with a t-test. Well, first of all, the estimate of fold change on the log scale is very small because these are very small values, very similar to each other, right? And so DSIC is able to actually find the differences much better. And so this is for the t-test and DSIC. And this is, unfortunately, before adjusting for multiple testing. Now, when you adjust for multiple testing, t-test loses all of its changes, and the DSIC finds a limited number of changes. So it still has some false positives, but it's not like the same numbers here. Remember, it was only 6 spiked proteins, right? So my take on that is that the most important contribution of working with DSIC is the fact that they actually accurately reflect count data. So this extra variance stabilization, well, it's an extra bells and whistles, and we have seen kind of in our experience that when you have more than 4 replicates, just like lemma, it doesn't do very much. It doesn't help you. So, but if you have a very small number of replicates, well, you probably don't expect too much anyways, right, from the spectral counting with 2 replicates, right, between the groups. So only some really big changes. Okay, let me take a second. Yes?
So for the count data, how do you calculate the full change? So you just subtract?
No, so this is part of this. So this is a little bit more advanced because these are count data. What you actually, the statistical term for this is a log linear model. So what you will actually do, you will first find this normalization factor, and then you will express the log of this mu gi as some function which involves the groups. And there will be some statistical approach around this. It's called maximum likelihood, which will essentially estimate the difference between the groups as function of this kind of negative binomial fit. So there is no simple equivalent of differences on the log scale. So it always works on the original scale, and it's based on kind of a little bit more complicated methods.
I worked with DSIC before, so they calculate something called the R log or something. Is that the same?
It calculates what?
Something called the R log transform values. So the DSIC, I think.
Before DSIC 2?
Yeah.
Okay, so DSIC 1 or the DSIC and DSIC 2 has.
DSIC 2 has R log or something.
Well, so I'm not very confident of that. I don't know. But what I can tell you is that there was a really big change between DSIC and DSIC 2 because original DSIC also used negative binomial distribution, but the way it was done was very limited to like 2 group comparisons or 3 group comparisons or things like that. They changed the way they modeled that to accommodate much more complex experimental designs. So they can now have batch effects, they can have confounders and all of that. And the statistical technology behind it is different. Now, what the output is part of this, I don't know off the top of my head.
But the t-test plot that you showed, so the fold change in that one also accommodates something like those logs.
Oh, you do have the estimate of fold change at the end for sure. But the word that you just used.
No, the t-test, for the t-test, how do you calculate the fold change?
Oh, for the t-test, yeah. So you take the log of the counts, and you have 0. You probably have infinity. I don't know what happened here. Yeah. So the regular t-test. And as I said earlier, if your counts are in a large range, it's actually fine. So problems really happen when it's very close to 0. But when the counts are 12 and larger, it's probably okay. And so probably what happened here is that there are some abundant proteins in the background for which t-test actually worked. But the challenge for us is that we do not design an separate experiment for each protein. So and the analysis. So we have a whole bunch of proteins, and some of them have very small counts, others have large counts, and we have to find a way which handles all of them appropriately.
You didn't use the word log here, that's why I wanted to ask you.
Well, actually, I don't have the slides, but actually maybe we can look at here. Oh, I see.
That's why
I see. And this is log fold change. Okay, thank you. Now I see it, because, of course, this is like -100, this is 100. You're right, it's actually my typo. You're right. So you get the fold change, and you can have a log or no log for it, right? Whatever you want to do in terms of reporting, right? But the way the number is obtained, for count data, it comes from here. For t-test, which is the wrong way to do it, but technically you can do it, right? Take the log of the counts, take the difference, and all of that. So technically you can do it.
Can you use nonparametric tests to compare the two groups?
Well, here is my nonparametric question. Last week I was wondering why nobody asked that. So yes and no. So you can, but so just for those of you who have not heard this, so nonparametric means that we don't want to assume any distribution, right? So we don't want to say it's normal or it's Poisson, a negative binomial. We'll say it's an arbitrary distribution. So essentially what we will say is, for a particular protein, we have two groups. In one group, we'll draw a histogram and it has something. In the other group, we'll draw another histogram and it has something. And we don't care about what these histograms are. We just want to know if this mean is different from this mean. And this can be counts, this can be intensities, or whatever we want, right? So first of all, nonparametric is kind of a misnomer, because nonparametric makes you think that you have no parameters, which is actually the opposite. So to describe the distribution now, we need to have the height of each bar in the histogram. So we need to have more parameters, because each height here becomes a parameter. But the important point is that, so when we try to compare these distributions, we do some permutations or some kind of summaries of the data. It is always the case in statistics that the less information you bring into the problem, the less sensitive you are. So it's more difficult to find changes. And so you pay the price of sensitivity for the flexibility of working with this type of models. So how do we improve the sensitivity? We have more data. If we have more data, what happens? Well, certain limit theorem applies, right? And we can just use the regular approaches anyways. So I personally find nonparametric methods not useful at all, because if we have a small sample size, those histograms are not reliably estimated. We have a lot more parameters to keep track of. We have more difficulties finding changes. So I would rather advocate for having more replicates. And if we have more replicates, we can either work with these methods or we can work with the inception limit theory. So I don't really use that very much. Yeah. So the difference is the p-value. So this is the raw p-value, 0.05 cutoff, and this is p-value adjusted on false discovery rate cutoff. Exactly. So the whole thing is an original p-value, and this is the whole thing. Oh, I see now all my typos here. Sorry. Okay, let me just so that it's clear. This is the log fold change. Okay, so let's make sure that everything is changed. And here is the actual p-value. It's not adjusted p-value. Thank you. I'll make sure to correct my copy as well. Okay, so hopefully it is better. Yes. Okay? Okay, well, so I'm again behind the schedule very much. So let's see. I have some discussion on principal component and hierarchical clustering. So after the break, or take longer? What do you prefer? Do you prefer take maybe 10 minutes to do PCA or after the break? How do you feel? Who wants break now? Okay, who can wait 10 minutes? Okay, let's do at least a little bit of that, and then we will see how that goes. Okay, so so this part finishes, I believe, at least as far as I'm concerned, class comparison. So looking at the means between two groups. So the rest of today and tomorrow we will talk about the other two goals, right? So one is class discovery, so essentially heat maps and PCA and things like that. And the other is class prediction, so when we actually want to predict the status of individual samples. Okay, so two methods which are kind of frequently used, principal component analysis and hierarchical clustering. So let's talk about PCA, and maybe we'll leave clustering for after the break. So principal component analysis is a method for data visualization. It can also be thought of as data summarization, dimension reduction, things like that. But it's all unsupervised in that we really don't use the labels. So here on the picture, this is from the Nature Methods summary. So the labels here, let's say this is group 1, this is group 2. It's interesting for us to use it, but the method never uses the information on this label. So we'll only use it for visualization. So let me maybe just repeat on the blackboard the figure. So, and I'll probably do a more extreme version of that. So let's say we only have 2 proteins in our study. So this is protein 1 and this is protein 2. And so let's say the proteins are actually very highly correlated. So the points here, they're biological samples, right, which are characterized by both proteins. And so even though we have technically 2 proteins, we really have just one piece of information because they are redundant, right? They kind of do the same thing. So PCA essentially tries to say how much non-redundant information I have in this data set. So step 1 in PCA is to take the center of coordinates and move it in the center of the cloud of the data. So mathematically what it means is, so if this is my data structure, and traditionally, so you notice it's flipped, right? So here samples are on the rows and genes are on the columns. This is unfortunately how R looks at it as well, because traditionally we look at samples in the space of the genes. So genes are viewed as variables, and traditionally variables are in columns. So it's flipped from our usual wide format representation. So how do we move the center of coordinate from here to here? What we do is we look at the first gene or protein. We calculate the mean over every sample, subtract the mean. We have the second gene, calculate the mean over all the samples, subtract the mean, right? Take the last gene, take its mean, subtract the mean, right? So if this is the mean here in this gene, we move it here. If this is the mean, move it here. This is our new center of coordinates. And so the second thing we do, we take our coordinates and we rotate them. And maybe that's what the rotation kind of term came from earlier this morning. And we rotate them in the way that the first axis of the coordinate is in the direction of the largest variation across different samples. And of course, it's a system of coordinates, so the second has to be orthogonal to the first. So this is really all the principal component is doing. And so now, well, 2 things. One is, how do we get this direction? So this direction will be some number 1 times protein 1 plus some number 2 times protein 2. So these numbers, they're called loadings. And now what we can do, we can take each data point and project it on these new coordinates. And so the projection on, this new direction is called first principal component. And the projections of the samples on this principal component, they are called scores. So these new points here, they are called scores. And so the next thing we can do, we can say, okay, how much variation between samples we have in this dimension? Well, quite a lot, right? Now, how much variation we have between samples in this direction? Very little. So if, for example, this is 80% and this is 20%, then we will say, okay, we can actually remove this axis and we'll only lose 20% of variation between the data points. So it's not very useful. So we can actually keep only one direction. So this would be an example of reducing dimensionality from 2 proteins to 1 linear combination of proteins. So we didn't reduce the dimensionality because we have fewer proteins. So to do this thing, we will always have to have all the proteins in our data set. So we didn't select a subset of proteins. but we now have some orientations of these proteins which allow us to kind of have a smaller number of directions without losing much information. A question? Okay, so that's what we want to do, right? And so this is a good thing because this method assumes that essentially all variation is a good variation, right? So we want to find directions, linear combinations of proteins where the variation is maximized. However, this type of methods are sometimes misused. So one type of misuse is to assume that every variability is actually useful. So imagine a situation like this. So we have two proteins. So let's say this is protein 1 and this is protein 2. So, and let's say we have one protein which has a lot of variation between the samples, right? And then we have another protein which is very tightly regulated. But it turns out that this protein 2, which is actually associated with the disease. So let's say that all the crosses are healthy and all the circles are the disease. Okay. And so how would PCA proceed? Well, it will take the system of coordinates, put it in the center, and it will say, okay, let me now rotate this in the direction of most kind of largest variation. Well, it turns out here is actually this is the direction, right? I'm kind of exaggerating, but that's what happens, right? The orthogonal dimension is this, so not much shift. And now we'll say, let's see, here is the majority of the variation, so we keep this dimension, and this dimension we don't really care about. It has little variation. But in reality, what happened, we just lost the actual important information. So it was tightly regulated, but in a way that's important to us, right? This was variable, but in a way that's not important to us. But because the method doesn't have a sense of what's important, it will say, okay, this is the variation, so we'll just keep that. So that kind of emphasizes, so when we have this type of linear combinations of proteins, so if it kind of goes closer to this axis, so this V1 number will be larger than V2. And so if V1 is larger than V2, we'll say, okay, V1 is important, so protein 1 is more important than protein 2 because it has a larger number, it has a larger loading. And so people tend to interpret these loadings as some kind of weight of importance of a protein in the principal component. And this is completely wrong because here's a situation where protein 1 will have very high loading. In fact, it will be 1 times protein 1 plus 0 times protein 2 because we didn't rotate anything, right? And so now protein 1 has very high loading and we say it's very important, but in reality we lost what really mattered to us. So for this reason, and I see this a lot, unfortunately, when people do PCA and they have high loadings and they claim that they found biomarkers. It has nothing to do with biomarkers, right? So I want to make sure it's clear. Okay. All right. So that's what's going on. And so another plot which is often made frequently, so this would be the order of principal components, and this is the proportion of variance explained by this principal component. So if the first principal components explain large percent, we kind of say, okay, we can give up the rest. If not, it kind of means that even our first two principal components, they're not really very useful. Okay, so this is one issue, right, with principal components, because it kind of highlights the variation which is not useful. And by the way, so the implication of this, is the consequence of this, is that PCA works best when nuisance variation or error or within group variation is comparable between the genes. Because then if we do see some variation, it's more likely to be induced by the stress than noise variation. And so remember, I think earlier we had a question about VSN normalization, variance stabilizing normalization. So this will be normalization which forces each protein to have the same variation. So it scales the variation everywhere. And I mentioned I don't really like it because it has too many parameters and extra fitting to this. You can overfit easily. But specifically for the purpose of PCA, if you really want to do PCA, it may be a good idea to do some work on your protein so that the variance is comparable. Then you're maybe more likely to see changes on PCA which are really useful. But again, I think it's an overuse. It's an overuse of this. It's really so easy to overfit the data in high dimensions. And actually, here is, I think it's, yeah, I have a little bit more on what happens when we have very high dimensional data. But let me just stop for a second. So how are we doing with just what PCA is? Yes?
You said the variance has to be comparable within the group or across the
Within the group, right? So let's say this is group 1, right? And this is group 2. So we look separately at crosses and separately at circles, right? So protein 1 among crosses has a lot more variance than protein 2. And the same thing among the circles. Protein 1 has a lot more variance than protein 2. And that's the problem, because now we think that this variance is somehow informative, when really it's the difference between crosses and circles. So if you had a situation where you had similar variance in both directions, so then whatever changes there, so if this is protein 1 and protein 2, so let's see if I can make it. So essentially, within this group, protein 1 has the same variation and protein 2 has the same variation. Okay, so now you would move this to the center of the cloud, right, and you will rotate this in this direction. So now this really separates into groups. But this is because the circles and the crosses have the same variance in the x-axis, and they also have the same variance in the x-axis and the same variance in the y-axis. So then whatever difference remains, it's not within group variance, it's between group variance. But as I say, it's probably overdoing it a little bit. So, but if variance is comparable within the group, then it can work. Okay? Okay, very last point on PCA, and this is also quite important. So, okay, one thing is that not every variation is an important variation to us. But the second aspect of our data set is that we have many proteins. And in fact, the more proteins we have, the more likely we are to use PCA. That's kind of my impression. And so let me show you a little bit. So this is coming from a statistics paper, but it's very low technical paper. So it's just primarily discussion where these authors study specifically the effect of dimensionality on our conclusions. So they make a fake data set by simulation. So they have 100 observations, so kind of like what I was showing earlier. So two groups. So completely fake. Completely fake data. So this is group 1. This is group 2. So they have 100 observations from 2 classes, I think. So yeah, it's 100 people here and 100 people here. So now they have 10 dimensions. So this is 1, 2, up to 10, which actually have some differences between the groups. So they just built it in so that these values are systematically different from these values. And then everything else is just noise. So starting from 10 and all the way up to n is just noise. So no difference between groups whatsoever. And so now they make several plots. So the first plot only has actually 2 dimensions. So they first just chop the first 2 proteins, and they only make principal components from 2 proteins, which is just orienting our data, right? So we don't do any dimension reduction. And of course, because they simulated it in a way that this is different from this, we clearly see the 2 groups as quite different on the plot. Now, the next thing they do, they have 40 dimensions. So they now chop it at 40 subdivisions. So now 10 really have differences, but 30 are just noise between the groups. So you see now how the blue and the red points start overlapping. The next thing, they have 200 features. So now they chop it at 200. And there is an overlap. And the next is at 1,000. And you cannot tell things apart anymore. And so this is what happens. So when we have more and more dimensions, so we essentially have a lot of this type of situations when things vary across samples just randomly. And PCA will tend to pick them up more and more, and we'll be losing more and more the actual informative features which define the differences in the first place. And this is very common. So the more things you quantify, the more the signal is buried, essentially, in these PCA plots. And it's the same data, right? They didn't even regenerate the new data. They just kept adding more features in this table. And so that kind of sets our expectations, right, from those experiments. Of course, it depends how much differences between the groups and so on, but qualitatively it will always be the same. And so let me just illustrate what's happening for our ABRF data set. And you can actually see it very clearly here. I only took a subset of proteins which were spiked. And here I took all the proteins. And you see that spiked proteins are like crystal clear, right? But if I add all the proteins, PCA does not look the same.
So if you add one more principal component to the plot, so you make a 3D plot, maybe?
Not really. Look at this, right? So this shows cumulative percentage of variation, right? So the first principal component explains 60%. The first two explain 90%.
Yeah, but when you use all the proteins, then you get a little bit more of the variation.
No. So here, all the proteins, the first principal component only explains 30% of variation, and the first two, 40% of variation. So now, to get to the, whatever, 90%, you need, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 principal components. That's exactly the point, right? Because you have more features, so more variation, so your first two principal components don't tell you the whole story. So again, my opinion about PCA is that it's only useful as a quick screen to find some really gross deviations from the bulk. And those gross deviations usually happen for quality control reasons. And so as a QC screen, it's very good. You will really see things which stand, because usually problems with QC affect many things, so you will see kind of big changes. As far as the biology, unless you reduce your number of features to some small number, it's really hard to expect much. But then let's say we reduced our number of features using a t-test, and then do a PCA based on the features which have small p-values. So technically, no problem, right? We can do this. In practice, it's not an unsupervised method anymore, because we already used group information to do the t-test, right? So when we cannot claim that we discovered some new structures, because we used the structures to do the t-test in the first place. So, again, these methods tend to be overused a little bit.
Is that level of noise where you're seeing basically the first principal component only explaining like 30% of the variation, is that typical in proteomics experiments?
I would say so, yeah. And remember, by the way, this is a Spanking experiment. It doesn't even have biological variation, right? You have a constant background. So I would say it's probably even worse in real life. Yeah. Okay, and the very last thing. So I just also wanted to, I erased, but essentially talking about the loadings, right? And how the loadings relate to p-values. And essentially to emphasize that high loadings don't necessarily mean important proteins in any way. So just as a kind of thought experiment, I did this thing where I am plotting the loadings on the x-axis and adjusted p-value on the y-axis. And so I do twice, once only for spiked proteins and the other for all proteins. And the p-values are obtained, sorry for the slides, also comparing condition 1 to condition 2, like we had here. So I always compare condition 1 to condition 2. And so it is very clear that if we look at all the proteins, the relationship between the loadings, the p-value, there is none, right? So it really is all over the place. But if we only focus on spiked proteins, of course, right? So now it's 3 corners because I'm only comparing condition 1 and condition 2. Some proteins are important for other conditions, right? So the p-value is only on 2 pairs of samples, but we have 4 samples. So loadings reflect all the 4. P-values only reflect the first 2 groups. But so it's pretty clear, right, that the relationship between loadings and p-values will be essentially negatively impacted by the dimensionality. Okay, so I think it's time to break. So